Appreciate you, bro. This is going to be nice. All right, Dr. Brother Eddie Cole. I'm so happy that you're joining us here on the ISITHU, which is our opportunity to work with young Black men, young Black boys, and fathers, and just talk about relationships, uplift, things that will help them in the mentoring program and the fatherhood initiative. And so I have a question for you. First, I want you to give us a little bit about your background. How did you come from, little Eddie Cole to Dr. Eddie Cole at UCLA?
Yeah, that's a good question. I appreciate it, Brother Dr. Smith, for having me. Let me just say, for those of you who don't know, I was born in a town called Bologee, Alabama, which is in the Alabama Black Belt in Greene County, so West Central Alabama. So it's a small town, predominantly Black county. And if you know anything is sort of about Black history, it's one of those regions that was deeply intertwined with the institution of slavery. And so the remnants of that is a predominantly Black area. That's where my family's from for generations. But when you think about that area now, fast forward, you can imagine the disparities, right? From public funding around basic utilities that we've been woefully under-resourced. And so I'm from a family of educators, right? So when you think about little Eddie and now being a professor at UCLA, I got to give some tribute and a shout out to really my grandparents first, who are public school teachers in rural West Alabama. And then my grandparents, and then my dad and my mother, both now retired public school teachers in rural West Alabama. And so part of me, how I came to be what I am now, really is a testament to sort of the value of education, particularly public education in the rural Black South. And so one example of how that history, right, that Black history and education inform how I think about my work today is that my public school, which is located in one town over, Eutaw, Alabama, which is also in Greene County. Eutaw spelled E-U-T-A-W, not U-T-A-W. In Eutaw, Alabama, my public high school, actually on the street behind my high school, no more than 500 yards away, was a private, predominantly white academy, which historians refer to as a segregation academy. Ultimately, when the public schools in my home county were forced to desegregate, the white families pulled their children out and started their own private school. So even in my lifetime, right, not to give away my age, but even in my lifetime, you can imagine fairly recently that the remnants of segregation still shape how I came to see education. And much of my mentoring through the public schools in Greene County, Alabama, can be attributed to those Black teachers that saw me from kindergarten all the way through the 12th grade. And I give a lot of love and shout out to them to instilling the value of education and the power of education, and how education spins off to so much more in terms of Black organizing beyond the schoolhouse, right? So when you think about Black teacher associations throughout the civil rights era and how those associations were able to strategically navigate the barriers of Jim Crow, I was taught by the teachers who came through that era, right? So as they were retiring, I was sort of the last generation that they touched. And so much of my work now, as I think about being a professor at UCLA, asking broader questions about the Black freedom struggle and education, much of it really is tied to my own personal history.
Well, you have a very impressive career, and so far, you got so much more to go, and we'll talk about that later.
Sure.
But a PhD is not an easy accomplishment. So I'm sure there were some hurdles, some roadblocks that were put in front of you.
Yes.
How did you persevere? How did you overcome that?
Yeah, that's a great question too. One is about support systems, right? Much of being able to navigate the many challenges toward eventually earning a doctorate is understanding that you don't do it on your own, right? If you look at any decent author, even if you look through a dissertation, look at their acknowledgments and look at just how many people they thank along the way, because no scholar is just so brilliant that they just came to that point by themselves. And I'm no different. I mean, I might say that I'm an exaggerated example of needing help along the way, especially considering where I'm from. And so one example, let me we just have a frank conversation, because many of us who may be listening to me talk right now may come from environments that you don't have sort of equal access to all the resources in the world, right? Similar to how I grew up in rural, underserved West Alabama. One thing for me, when I even think about going to college, let's not even get to a PhD. Let's just think about going from high school to college.
Mhm.
My high school is 30 minutes max away from the University of Alabama.
Wow.
Everybody hears about that university now, especially all of this football success the last decade or so. But let's just talk about it from an academic institution. It's the biggest university, hands down, within my immediate hometown, right? But I don't have a single memory of a recruiter coming from that university to my small high school out in the country, right? I don't have a memory. The opportunities for me truly came by way of historically Black colleges and universities, right? Those were the schools that might have sent a recruiter every once in a while. They certainly sent brochures. And so when you think about educational opportunity, it's also important to understand how I had teachers who were able to guide me through the application process. I have a clear, vivid memory of one of our fraternity brothers right now from NE, Alabama A&M, being in the post office when I dropped off an application, a paper application to apply to college, because I'm not quite that young, right? I was still applying by paper to go to college. And I remember like him being in Omega and speaking to him as I was dropping my application in the mail for college, right? And people like that were so important to me. Those teachers were my support system from day one. And every time I go home, there's just a number of them that I still try to see. And they're going to be upset if I come home and don't see them, right? I mean, that's sort of how you have to understand that there are people rooting for you along the way. It doesn't have to be every teacher. It doesn't have to be every person in the community, but those people who take interest in you, or those people who you're interested in what they're doing, cling on to them and take their advice, and then tailor that advice as needed to make it fit your goals and what you're trying to do. So when I think about a PhD, I just sort of think of like an ongoing list of acknowledgments, an ongoing list of thanks and gratefulness, because so many people have poured into me, and it leaves me a huge obligation to do the same thing for people coming behind me.
Wow, that was just a beautiful statement. And I believe a lot of brothers feel the same ways, particularly those who come through all kind of hurdles and accomplishments that they look back. It's like that Sankofa,
Yes.
back and going forward, pulling other people with you. One of the sayings is history is our best teacher, right?
Yes.
And I love historians, and I love historians' minds, because I mean you can take a lot of information and put it together so it's understandable in that historical and contemporary moment. Can you walk us back to about 1910
Mm-hmm.
on the campus of Howard,
Yes.
prior to 1911 when Omega Psi Phi fraternity was founded? What did it look like then? What was happening in Black America? And
Yes.
why was it important for an organization like Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated to be born?
Yeah. Now, let me tell you, that's such a beautiful question, and it should give us all such a great opportunity to just sort of pause and reflect. Because to understand Howard University in 1910, you got to understand the broader context of what's happening in America during this time frame, especially facing Black Americans. Now, when we talk about slavery, right, it's easy to talk about enslavement, right, from sort of this distant, long, long time ago. But when you talk about 1910, Emancipation Proclamation happening in early 1860s, there are people still alive who remember the formal institution of slavery. And so much of society is still built around that premise. And so when you think about educational opportunity, right, because Howard's a university, it's not just it's sort of a common school, a local elementary school, it's a university, which is a rare space by this time frame, right? There are a lot of Black colleges, as historian for fraternity brother James Anderson writes in his famous book, The Education of Blacks in the South. There are a lot of colleges, but they're college in name only, because much of education through the late 1800s into the early 1900s was about taking the children and the offsprings of the formerly enslaved and teaching them the basics of education. So many things that we think about as universities today, they weren't universities just yet. In many ways, they were glorified elementary schools. Then
Mhm.
as students learned what elementary education was, they moved on to become middle schools, and then eventually, secondary high school level before moving people on into being able to study at the collegiate level, right? And so it's important to understand that Howard is a rare space during this time frame because so few Black Americans had access to university level learning, university level curriculum during this time frame. Howard is rare. I mean, even the Black colleges that exist during that time, again, they're colleges in name only, but it's really probably a handful academic spaces, Black colleges where Black people could access higher education. The other spaces were the usual predominantly white universities that enroll, maybe a dozen of us on the entire campus across the Northeast, Midwest, and occasionally out on the West Coast. So that's why Howard becomes a special place because it's where arguably the brightest and most resourced Black families were able to send their children to for an access to higher education in Washington, D.C. So that gives you an important capture of framing around as Omega is being born.
Right.
The next year in 1911, you had to understand just how rare of a space those students were in, our founders were in, and then also how they were able to make sense of the world because they knew they were in such a privileged position, and they designed a fraternity and organization that one of the cardinal principles was centered on uplift, meaning it wasn't just about what they were able to access, what they were able to gain. They built an organization that within the next decade soon turned one of its first initiatives, one of its first mandated programs was centered on Black history and Black literature around Black education. And so that's the kind of framing you have to understand when you think about Omega and its history, because wasn't just sort of a social fraternity based on friends. No, it was a bigger thing happening in a broader society. And that actually gives us a lot to reflect on today about the ongoing mission of the fraternity and what our work should be about.
That's powerful. Now, talk about those three undergraduates,
Mm-hmm.
faculty advisor,
Yes.
coming together. Why was it so essential to have manhood, scholarship, perseverance, and uplift be the cardinal principles?
Mm-hmm.
And friendship is essential to the soul as a model.
Yes. Yeah, well, when you think about the founders and the faculty advisor, those principles really, again, capture the moment that they were living in. And you just have to admire just how young they were
Yes.
as they were making sense of the world. Like these are young college students, fresh out of high school at Howard, and they have made an assessment of their campus and said, what this campus and what the broader society needs is an organization focused on these things. Now, manhood is important because when you think again about post-emancipation and think about just how the Black family and Black people in general had been terrorized in so many ways by white America, right? Something about manhood was essential in sort of standing up front and saying, here's what's valuable, here's what's key to us creating our own solutions to our own challenges as a race. So manhood up front is very intentional. Scholarship next being essential because to solve complex problems, right? Not only sort of academic problems, but to solve broader societal problems. Scholarship is at the heart of coming up with those solutions, right? So the founders also understood that too, right? You have to read broadly. You have to understand so many different other aspects of life to even make sense of the world that you're in. You might want to change the world, but if you don't understand the world, you're not going to be able to do so. And scholarship, right? The opportunity to study at the collegiate level was at the heart of that as well. Now, perseverance is key also because they understood that when you look over the past 2 centuries before 1911, it had to take a sustained ongoing effort to work toward racial equality, especially for Black Americans, right? So perseverance isn't just an idea. Perseverance is an actual tangible trait that was needed. And again, the founders understood this, right? Perseverance is something that we're not going to solve this problem by 1921, within our first 10 years as a fraternity. This is going to be an ongoing process, right? As the fraternity grows, we're going to have to always focus on these issues. It's going to be an ebb and flow in terms of pushback from white supremacist ideas. So you're going to have perseverance, right, to be able to do so. And then uplift is also broadly defined in the sense that uplift is not only about sort of serving others exclusively within the context of a collegiate fraternity. Uplift was an ongoing ethos that had to be intertwined within your sort of professional and personal life. That's what I really admire about the history of the fraternity, because it's so clear, especially in the early decades, how the fraternity was so centered on, look, if I'm a doctor, if I'm a dentist, if I'm a lawyer, if I'm a teacher, regardless of your profession, you were in it in a certain way that centered on being one, extreme example, representative of the race, but also how can you make a meaningful contribution within your respective industry, right? That is so important, right? So uplift isn't just about sort of the immediate one-to-one, hey, you need some help, so let me help you, but it's also about how can I be a model for others, right? How can I also translate what I've learned and make it applicable not only to Black America, but truly in many ways hold the United States and the global community accountable for the hypocrisy of saying it's a democracy while at the same time, right, treating Black people like second-class citizens. That's also embedded within uplift. So when you think about those cardinal principles and the founders, it's truly remarkable to think about just how young they were. And also, to be clear, their faculty advisor, Professor Ernest Everett Just, was also a very young scholar at this time, right? So all four of them really, in the grand scheme of life, are very young during this time frame. And they're coming up with some of the most complex ideas that in many ways are so applicable to many of the challenges that we see right now every day on the news.
Right. And I mean, it just is a testament to how brilliant these four individuals were. Later, Ernest Everett Just goes to University of Chicago to become and get his PhD.
Yes.
The three undergraduates graduate.
Yes.
They only spend a couple of years as undergraduate students. The majority of their life were spent as Omega men in graduate chapters.
Yes.
Alumni chapters, whatever. But they were making a huge commitment to the uplift of Black America.
Yeah.
What were some of those highlights throughout some of these periods?
Oh, wow. It's amazing to think about their careers, especially considering how Jim Crow prominence was not only limited to the United States, but also abroad, as we see with Dr. Just, who spent, the later half of his life in Europe. So some of those contributions during this time frame are so interesting. And I'm going to give you a little sneak peek on something that's really, really impressive that these brothers were doing, even as they moved on with their careers, as graduate members of graduate chapters established throughout the United States. But, Omega really turns its attention in the 1920s toward education. And this attention toward education is so impressive because what they understood, even though they had professions within the clergy as actual medical doctors and scientists, right? They also understood that education impacted every facet of Black life, right? So regardless of your industry, right? They didn't have to be formal educators, right? But they understood education as important. Now, something happens as the fraternity continues to expand with those cardinal principles at the forefront. A challenge comes that they realize that the Black colleges that enroll the majority of Black students actually were, as I mentioned earlier, colleges in name only. And that actually created a dilemma for the fraternity, saying that if we're a collegiate fraternity and we want to expand to this campus or that campus, we've got to do something about the curricular offerings at these campuses. This is a sort of a fun fact that many people are about to know about soon, but the fraternity, believe it or not, actually ultimately created, a fraternity brother named Theophilus McKinney actually creates the National Association of Registrars and Deans for Collegiate Schools.
Mm.
which becomes a Black run, essentially an accreditation agency that brought together Black deans and registrars across Black colleges across US South to streamline and assess what's a meaningful curriculum for different types of Black colleges. So at a time where sort of the white power structure just said, here's a Negro school, right? At a time when the white structure said that, through Omega, in sort of assessing how it was expanding, actually took an active role in assessing the curriculum at Black colleges, saying, hey, here's what the Black land grant college needs. Here's what the private Black college need, focus on liberal arts. Here's what the sort of vocational center, industrial education Black college needs. This is this is an essential turning point that happens within the first 15 years of Omega existing. And ultimately, that's when you see a lot of chapters, especially Omega chapters chartered at public historically Black colleges across the South, start to finally get chapters in the late 1920s and early 1930s, because again, of the founders, even as graduate members, right, long gone from their undergraduate studies, very much understood how essential it was, right, to take their efforts and understanding of racial uplift, right, which is a term that was commonly used during that time, and earmarking it toward education, because once again, they understood the value of education, even though they were in industries that were outside of the day-to-day education teaching. They understood the role that the fraternity should, could, and did play in shaping Black educational experiences for people well beyond just members of the fraternity. This fundamentally changed Black higher education as we know it today.
Wow, that's amazing. That is a little, great piece of information to share and to be proud of as Omega men.
Mhm.
And one other thing that many people seem like they turn to us for is mentoring.
Yeah.
How is that kind of through line of mentoring
Mhm.
maintained itself throughout history in the fraternity?
Yeah. That's a great question. That the role of mentoring and its consistency really over more than a century. In so many ways we see it, and it's really interesting to watch how so many Omega men have been selfless in sort of turning toward younger brothers in the fraternity, but also younger people in general, and bringing them along and sharing what they know. I mean, it's truly remarkable. I can even, say in our conversation, I admire our relationship because you served as a mentor to me in so many ways. And we see that in the fraternity, right? In many ways, we're just living a tradition, right? We're not doing anything that we created on our own. This is something that has been in place from the very beginning. And that mentoring emerged in so many different ways. You think about Carter G. Woodson and the origins of what is now considered Black History Month. That was amplified through Omega after our 1920 conclave in Nashville, Tennessee, when Carter G. Woodson was the primary speaker there, and fraternity chapters across the nation were chartered and expanded their effort to take Black literature and history into their local communities. I mean, fraternity like Omega going into their local newspaper and sitting down with community members and teaching them about their history. I mean, that is just powerful. And this is just the 1920s. By the time we get to the 1930s, you see that same sort of mentoring emerge through the fraternity as Omega members become key in sort of Black insurance companies and establishing Black banks during the financial collapse in the United States. You see that same mentoring continue when you get into the 1940s and 1950s, when the early Black attorneys, those first Black attorneys in the 1920s and 1930s, become mentors to who eventually become Omega attorneys that work for, say, the NAACP and lead major legal battles for civil rights through the 1940s, 1950s. And then you get to the 1960s and you see that same sort of mentoring continue with Omega when you think about the civil rights protests continue. And Omega Man, right? Bayard Rustin actually organizes the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. I mean, this is what Omega does, right? This is sort of intertwined within the fraternity itself, this mentoring. And then you see the same thing go on through the 1970s and 1980s when you think about sort of the broader questions around fighting for challenging apartheid, right, in South Africa and holding US companies accountable for those apartheid practices and profiting off of apartheid in the United States. That's Omega men still involved with that as well, right? And so it's one of those things where you sort of think over, the past century and you think about mentoring and you see a program like this that's very much committed to mentoring the youth. You see that this is only, again, an extension of what the fraternity has considered a valuable asset of itself, is being able to pay it forward, right? Because if you're not lifting as you're ascending, right, then what's the point of even climbing your ladder of success, right? So it's one of those things that when we think about mentoring today, we have to sort of, again, stop, pause, and reflect and say, this is what we should be doing because the fraternity demands as much. And that's what the fraternity has emphasized really since November 1911.
Yeah, and it is so powerful because even if we look at Morehouse College,
Mm-hmm.
Benjamin E. Mays, brother
Yes.
Benjamin E. Mays was Martin Luther King Jr.'s mentor.
Yes.
And King credits him with so much of his development. So
Yes.
you're right. It's been powerful and dynamic and re-energizing throughout the history of our fraternity. And we have a fraternity brother who wrote a book, Tussle to the Top. And he talks about this kind of friendly competition between Alpha Phi Alpha and Omega Psi Phi, and how Omegas just historically pushed education and received all these awards and professional awards, and that Omega was always on top. And I think about that when I was in college,
Mm-hmm.
looking at the presidents of HBCUs and seeing a disproportionate number of Omega men as
Yeah.
presidents. I mean, what is that connected to? Some aspect of the fraternity's history.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm writing something right now that will soon be public, and people within the next year will enjoy just how many Omegas have served as college presidents and university chancellors, and really that goes back to the very beginning. In fact, that conversation around Omega deciding to adopt an initiative toward Black education, especially Black colleges and universities, much of that is credited to those Omega men who were the presidents or on the faculty at those same Black colleges. And we're talking about the 19 teens in the 1920s and through the 1930s, right? And this is important because the fraternity actually has a debate that it doesn't sacrifice its emphasis on scholarship just because a brother is the president of that college, right? And so it was very sort of fun to get into that history, because we would do the same thing now. We would hold each other accountable to ensure that we were doing our best within our professional roles, not only to be representative of the fraternity, but also to be representative of the greater good toward Black America. And so when you think about this sort of friendly rivalry between, if you use the alphas, and some people say the kappas and other organizations, Omega has always understood the power of coalition building. Let's be clear, because Omega, as much as we've been focused on ourselves, our greater goal has always been on the broader uplift of the Black community. And so that also means that at times we have worked across fraternal lines, right, toward these initiatives. And Benjamin Elijah Mays, the longtime president at Morehouse College, president at Morehouse from 1940 to 1967, is the perfect example, because he mentored dozens, if not hundreds, of Black men. In many cases, he was admired by the women across the street at Spelman College. So let me not just say Black men. Benjamin Mays mentored dozens of Black students,
Right.
who for years to come will go on to be world changers. And so many of them, not just Martin Luther King, but so many of them fondly reflect on Benjamin Elijah Mays as an Omega of significant prominence, and just how he was a world changer just right there in Atlanta alone. And Benjamin Mays is just one example, right? You could go from Morehouse and Benjamin Mays being president. You could go up to look at William Trent Johnson, who's the president of Livingstone College, right there in North Carolina, right? You can go from there in North Carolina and you can go to up to Hampton right now, right? And look at Brother Harvey, who's president there. I mean, it's really a lineage, right, of Omega leading so many college campuses, because once again, if you're going to lead any industry, I mean, leading education, again, is going to touch every other industry. Thus, it's going to impact every aspect of American life, because people, those of us who are interested in going into corporate careers and business, those of us who are interested in, going into the medical fields, at some point, you're going to have a touch point with a college campus, right? And so that shows again why Omega, as much as other fraternities might like to sort of toot their own horn, it's hard not to give love to Omega because of just what it has done for higher education in general. And also understanding, let me make this point extremely clear, because I don't want this to only be sort of focused on people who have access to education. Omega has always been deeply interested with also who's considered sort of working class America as well, right? People who don't necessarily have access or interest in attending a college or university, but we have long understood that our impact has an opportunity to change the lives of all people. And that's not just exclusively for those of us who are on a college campus, in the same way that the founders understood that establishing the fraternity wasn't exclusively about the Howard University community. They understood that there was something much bigger than Howard University, and in our case, something much bigger than our ivory towers, if you will. That means that our work must extend into local communities to impact who's considered, the common person just trying to make it day to day as well.
Yeah, I think that's important because, I mean, obviously our talent hunt competition is an example of that, and how we try to help develop young people's talent in the creative arts, performing arts, I mean, all over. So yeah, you're right on with that. Is there any other important thing that we should know that these mentors, these brothers that are working with the Fatherhood Initiative should understand about Omega's role historically or contemporarily? And then we'll touch on your book, the Campus Color Line, next.
Yeah, absolutely. The fathers right now should know that there is an ongoing obligation, right, among members of the fraternity to mentor and serve, right? That's historically and in contemporary sense. And you got to understand that, as you're thinking about this program, it's so important to understand just the power of tradition and lineage of such mentoring, right? The goal of this isn't only for it to be transactional one way. It's actually intended for us to mentor, right, the youth, and for those youth to go on and thrive and do the same thing and just pay it forward in whatever way they see fit. And that's really what's been essential to success, not only for the fraternity, but how the fraternity has envisioned success for the broader community. And I think that's critical, right? It was so evident historically, especially when you think about during formal segregation and during Jim Crow, but we don't truly advertise that as much today as it was prominent, right? When you think about sort of the historical record from both white-run newspaper media organizations and Black-run media organizations, Omega Psi Phi had a distinctive reputation for what it was doing in the community, and its roster was beyond impressive from the 19 teens well through the 1970s and so forth. And we've got to understand that that roster remains just as impressive today, but the work has to continue in so many ways today. And that's the challenge that stands before us right now. And so a program like this is an exemplar, right? Example of what the fraternity has always meant in terms of its mission. And I'm very happy to be here in conversation with you about it today.
Great, I appreciate that. So now let's talk a little bit about the Campus Color Line and what we should know, like the Cliff Notes version, the Digest version. Take away from your book, because it's won book award. So we'll talk about your accomplishments after this, but share with us.
Yeah. The Campus Color Line, my book, published last year by Princeton University Press, is about the college presidency and the struggle for Black freedom. Thus, my interest in those former college presidents who are also Omega men. And really the takeaway here is that higher education, our colleges and universities, have long played an outsized role in shaping American society. Now, our historical memory doesn't always remember or hold colleges accountable for that history, but the book illuminates so many ways that the leaders of colleges and universities have shaped so many racial policies and practices, even if they shape them quietly. And it's important for us to remember that as we think about colleges and universities today, being some of the largest real estate owners in many cities, being the largest employer in many cities, having a direct line to both federal officials and state level officials. It's important for also to understand that the questions around racial equality are also deeply influenced by what our local institutions of higher education say about those issues. And that's important because when elected officials or corporate leaders don't know what to do, they often look toward a college or a university because oftentimes those places are considered, the spaces where they're the people who can solve complex problems. So as long as people look toward colleges and universities to solve complex problems, it's also important for us to remember the history of academic leaders who have weighed in on those complex racial problems and what decisions they've made, both for the good and for the worse, but also what we can learn from those decisions in the past. So that's the short sort of 1 minute 60-second version of the book.
But the most important thing is to buy the book because it is right. But tell us, where can they pick that book up?
Yeah, absolutely. You can buy the book directly from Princeton University Press online, or you can buy it through your usual corporate online sellers such as Amazon. And then my favorite is always to reach out to your local independent bookstore. Support these independent bookstores, especially this time of year when you get into the end of the calendar year, into the top of a new year. It's so critical to support an independent bookstore because they depend on it and they have a deep interest in their local community. So you can always go to your local bookstore, ask them about it. They'll have it for you in 2-3 days and you can go pick it up there.
Perfect. Now, tell us a little bit about Dr. Eddie Cole in this way. In order for young men, young boys to set goals, they have to be exposed to the possibilities that are out there. In your early career, you've achieved a lot. Can you tell us about some of those awards and accomplishments that you've been able to get?
Let me start with the frat first, because the frat bestowed a number of honors upon me at a critical time when especially as a graduate student, that were just sort of affirming to what I was doing. So, I went to graduate school, got my master's and my PhD at Indiana University, Bloomington. So shout out to the talented 10th D. And while I was in the 10th district, I won 3 consecutive years, the 10th district's graduate scholar of the year. At this point in my career, that wouldn't be considered a significant award in terms of financial supporting. But at that time, as a graduate student just trying to get it, that was some game changing support. So I appreciate that always, getting those awards 3 straight years. I want to say that's 2010, 2011, and 2012. Also in 2010, at the IHQ, at the international level, on the Raleigh Conclave, I got both the Founders Scholarship as well as the Georgie Mears Memorial Scholarship as well. And so those 2 international scholarships from the frat at a critical time when I was just building out my research agenda. As you hear from my early comments, I'm a historian. I'm always in the archives. It takes an effort to do that kind of research. Right? You got to travel places. You got to stay in the hotels. You got to get in there and whatever it costs to copy materials. So that financial support is important. But beyond finances, I just want to say that those early awards in my career were just essential. Sort of having the support of the brotherhood, but also the brotherhood saying that my work, my ideas were valuable. So I always got love for the frat for that. Then, sort of some professional accolades, just a few to say while working on the book. The National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation Fellowship in 2015 was a game changer for me. A couple of years later, I received from the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, another fellowship, which is the Mellon Emerging Leader Award from them. Also, the year after that, I received the Early Career Award, actually, from the Association for the Study of Higher Education. which was a notable moment in my career. And let's see, last year or earlier this year, actually, Education Week named me as one of the top 200, education scholars or scholars who have done the most to influence national educational policy and practice over the past year. And then the book award so far, I've won four different book awards from the History of Education Society, Association for the Study of Colleges, Association for the Study of Higher Education, then also the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and also the American Educational Studies Association. So that's a lot of associations. There's been, a lot of awards for a book. At a time when you write a book, not thinking about awards, but to get four of them so far, has been sort of mind blowing, to say the least. And so that's just a snapshot of some of the, accolades that my scholarship has received more recently, and some other stuff in between. But those are sort of the highlights, if you will. And if you're interested in reading shorter versions of my work, you can check me out on C-SPAN Book TV. If you go to C-SPAN, I think I'm on there a couple of times recently. I've been on BBC World News and got op-eds in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Chronicle of Higher Education, if you just want a sort of a 3-minute read instead of a 300-page book.
All those awards are well deserved. So
thank you, brother.
In closing, what do you want to have as your final words to the young Black boys, young Black men and fathers?
Yeah. Well, let me speak to the, as a father myself, I just want to show some love to other fathers because it's not easy. Let me just say that. So we in this together. Keep your head up. We working every day. But to the young boys, to the kids, teenagers, if you consider yourself a young adult, let me just say that you can do it. I mean, that's so simple, but I'm sure you don't hear it enough that what your goals are, what your dreams are, you can achieve them. Really, you can. Like you can really do this. And just know that it's okay to ask for help along the way. It's okay to sort of lean on other people along the way. And it's okay to sort of have some mistakes along the way. You don't have to be flawless. It doesn't have to be perfect. You listening to me at this point in my career, but every step wasn't as clean, right? There are decisions you make along the way. And for every award you heard that I've received, think about the 10 that I didn't receive, right? I mean, those things happen along the way. And so you just have to know that it's always about sort of getting a little bit better every day, right? That's your goal, right? You just want to say, okay, how can I do a little bit more every day? For those you listening who may be an athlete, how you're like, okay, I can lift this week. And then next month, I'm a little bit stronger. You have to think about your life in the same way, right? You have to think about its repetition, going through reps, continue to work out, continue to work your mind, continue to be the kind of friend that you want to be to other people, and continue to be the kind of son that you want to be to your parents, right? And just getting better every day, because we've all been there. And in the truest sense, there's nothing that you're going through that somebody else hasn't been through. So keep pushing through, and you'll be all right.
Well, brother, Dr. Eddie Cole, this fraternity has been made much better by having you as a member.
Oh, wow.
So thank you for, one, being a brother, and most importantly, being a friend, but also sharing this moment with other people so they can benefit from your knowledge. Thank you, my brother.
No, don't thank me. I always thank the frat. I'm paying it forward. Don't thank me. Do it for somebody else. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks again.
All right. Take care.
All right. So